Could you take the screen down now, James, please? Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Three Nations Dementia Working Group webinar. We're happy to be with you, and we hope you're enjoying this hot weather, but don't forget to keep yourself hydrated. Don't forget to drink, it's really important. And this morning, we'll be talking about issues around caring and the caring experience. And to help us do this, we've got a very good panel of people who have a lot of experience of the caring system. In the UK, there are about 700,000 people who are carers for a friend or a family member with dementia. And of course, as the number of people living with dementia increases, this number will rise inevitably as well. And there are many challenges that carers and family members face. The impacts of dementia could be far-reaching. According to one survey, 75% of carers feel that they don't, and others don't understand the effects of caring on their personal and social well-being, which obviously could lead to further pressures. My name is Nigel. I'm chair of the Three Nations Dementia Working Group. These webinars rely on you. We need your comments, responses, and questions via the text boxes, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. Please use these text boxes to ask questions, as we won't see you if you put your hand up or something like that, because we haven't got that facility. And I'd like to remind you that these webinars are designed and delivered by people living with dementia. So it really is the sort of things that we find important. We can't deal with individual queries, but we'll try to signpost via the text boxes as we go along. That's all from me, because you haven't logged in to listen to me. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Ma, who's going to take us through. Good morning, Ma.
Good morning, Nigel, and I'm really pleased to be here and to kind of share, I guess, some of my experiences of being a carer. And I've been asked to talk to a particular topic of dealing with carer fatigue and feeling constantly overwhelmed by the responsibilities. And so I'll spend about sort of 7 to 8 minutes talking about that from my experience. And when I was thinking about that as a subject and how I was really kind of had a sense that I was struggling in terms of my role as a carer, and perhaps not caring as well as I wanted to for my mother, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2004. And I kind of, looking back, I realized for a year after the diagnosis, because as a carer, and also for my mother who'd just been diagnosed, we had very little support at that time from the community sort of social support, social care. So I think I imagine, like a lot of people, I experienced some, a mixture of anticipatory grief. I felt compelled to somehow take control of the situation, partly from fear, because I didn't really understand what this now meant for my mother or even myself. So for a year, I kept myself very busy doing very kind of practical things for my mother, and just trying to keep her safe, and almost kind of taken over sort of daily tasks that she would perhaps have done in the past. And I kind of realized at a point, it was a year, and I remember it very clear, because I was in the kitchen and I was feeling really exhausted, and I had gone to make a sort of a cup of tea, because I knew it was quicker for me to make the tea on my own rather than sort of asking my mother to come and help with me. And she was in the other room. And I realized that actually what my mother wanted, rather than a cup of tea, was for me to be with her together. And I realized that over the year, from me kind of being very busy and kind of sort of taken on all these responsibilities, my mother had become more passive and I'd become more distant from her. And I kind of recognized that somehow this wasn't sustainable, and it was going to not necessarily break me, but it wasn't sustainable. I was really kind of not coping very well, I guess. And I thought, well, something's got to change. So I decided what I remember what my mother used to be very good at, and what we used to do together was crafting. So I set up doing these sort of craft encounters at home with her, because she was very good at knitting and sewing and embroidery, and actually spent, I think, over the sort of the years of caring for her, crafting became part of everyday dementia care, my caring for her, and we crafted every day, and actually it made a significant difference for her quality of life and my quality of life. And I eventually actually made a short film of us crafting together, and that was shown at a sort of film festival, and I think that will be shown, the link to that Vimeo link will be shared in the chat. And actually, just to kind of continue with this theme, I was trying to kind of understand how to be a better carer, I guess. And I was reading a lot of information about dementia care, but there's a lot of stats. I could see myself in the stats, but I couldn't really hear voices that were similar to mine. So it was partly a driver, for me to start a PhD in kind of understanding the lived experience, or exploring the lived experience of daughters looking after mothers with dementia, and how creativity could be used as part of everyday dementia care, and how, you know, perhaps returning to skills or things that maybe had been learned sort of previously could be maybe reignited, but those sort of haptic embodied skills sometimes stay in the body without us realizing it. And part of the PhD, which I'm still doing, I published a paper with one of the case studies, and there's and since then I've been working with other people looking at creativity and how that can support particularly carers in their role with the person that they're caring for. So it's not that the carer is separate and then they go and do a creative activity by themselves, but they do that with the person that they're caring for. So it becomes a very social activity that you can learn and do things together. So that was really what I wanted to touch on just in my sort of few minutes I have here, but happy to kind of answer questions, whether that's towards the end of these, after Jill and Ming have spoken, or I'm not quite sure what happens next, Nigel, but I think that's what I wanted to say, how creativity was a way of me reconnecting with being a daughter. And it was also a way of my mother reconnecting with her being a mother, or my mother, rather than just someone being looked after by her daughter.
Well, that's a very powerful piece of testimony there, but that you use existing skills and skills which you knew to develop a connection with your mother. And I'll certainly watch that video, which is in the chat box. But there's a question from Bethany Woodward. What can professionals working, and this is for all of you really, what can professionals working in the memory clinic do to help carers? What would be helpful? What would be? I'm not quite sure, because I remember my mother going to a memory clinic, and she would go on her own. I didn't really know what was kind of. I got a report at the end of sort of each session of what had happened, but I wonder whether there's some opportunity where the carers or people go along together, even if it's just for one session. So there's kind of a social aspect to that.
that question is, I would need to think about. I mean, it's a really good question, and I'm really pleased that it's asked, and I'd really like to kind of come back to that. Yes, but Bethany, let me think about that, and I'll come back to it if that's okay.
Can I just suggest one thing? When you're in shock, when you get a diagnosis, maybe that they say, can we have a follow-up appointment when you have some things have sunk in a bit, so that you can ask some of the questions that might come up, because you have no idea when they give you a diagnosis necessarily what's happening. So come back in a week or two, have a follow-up appointment where you can be helped, because giving a leaflet, a sheet of A4 about the Alzheimer's Society, when you have, in my case, doesn't even have Alzheimer's, is not. I think I was given a purple card that had crisis and a telephone number written on it, and that was my experience at a diagnosis at the memory clinic. So.
And can I just say, actually, a lot of people never get as far as attending a memory clinic. I mean, my mum, which I'll talk about a bit later when it comes to my turn, but, she lived with dementia symptoms for probably over 20 years, and she only had formal diagnosis towards the end of that when she was going into residential care. So we never got to a memory clinic. And if anyone had offered that to her, she would have refused it. So I think there is still a whole cohort of people who aren't being reached by any of those support networks, and I think it's very hard to know what to do about them, us, but I just put that out there for consideration.
Yeah, there's another question from Rupi, who says, followed on from Mal, who says, yes, I've done this with my own mother, my own parent. Our creative sessions have brought us together. So I don't know if she saw your video or whether she did it, but not did her own volition. But she says, it's quite important, carers need to be listened to, but not over the person with dementia. They're both individuals. And I think that really is important. And she follows it up by saying, good communication and understanding, and not overcomplicating, not trying to deal with everything in one appointment. And following what Jill says, follow-up is a good situation. Certainly, when I went through the diagnostic process, I didn't tell anybody, to be quite honest with you, and I went alone, and I found it as confusing in the situation I found myself in. Do you think something like a buddy system would work, that you'd have somebody in the memory clinic who'd been through the process, either as a carer or as somebody with a diagnosis, who could have a quick chat after diagnosis, or do you think it'd be too soon?
I mean, I think it's good to have that as an offer, and individuals can take that up when they are ready to, because sometimes you have to be have the right kind of frame of mind to. You might listen to something or hear it, but not necessarily take it on. And sometimes, yes, I think what Ming was saying, or Jill was saying, follow-up sessions are important, but then, it needs to be, if possible, if funding allows, more than one follow-up session, because it's potentially a long road ahead, and everyone's kind of journey, for want of a better word, is different and nuanced, and you're kind of discovering what works and what doesn't work. But to have the idea of having a buddy would be, I think that's a really, it would be for some people, that would be really useful, I think.
Good. Well, thank you for now, Mark. I'm sure we can come back to you in the course of this. And our next contributor is Jill. Good morning, Jill.
Good morning. I've been asked to talk about my experience of caring for somebody with incontinence. And so I decided I was going to make it a bit light-hearted at first, but then of course you get rather fed up with that. But I initially titled it Prisoner of Poo, because that's been my life for the last 3 years. My husband, just briefly, my husband has behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. He was diagnosed 6 years ago. And following a brain hemorrhage 3 years ago, he suddenly became urinary incontinent and fecal incontinent more or less at the same time. And after brain surgery, where they didn't notice that he was retaining, he damaged his bladder and he had to be then catheterized. So I've been through all the issues of constant changing of beds and everything else, when there was maybe 3 bed changes a night, etc. Uncontrolled fecal incontinence. Mainly this was to do with his brain hemorrhage, but it has left him in that condition. He has no control of his bowels or his bladder as a result. And his catheterization, for 6 months was the urethral catheter, several infections as a result, and then finally suprapubic catheter, where he still has infections, but certain things are more in control. I would like to sort of say everyone I know feared the fact that either the person living with dementia is fearful of the fact that they may become incontinent, and every carer I know is fearful of that happening and what they're going to do about it when it happens. Fortunately, I think for my husband, because he has frontal temporal dementia, he's lost a lot of those sort of senses. So he's really doesn't have the capacity to have any insight into that side of things, which in fact I'm actually quite grateful for, because his personality means he is fairly compliant with things. So I don't have some of the horrendous things I know some of my friends have told me about, where persons resist any help with their incontinence issues. However, we've had plenty of experiences of accidents and inappropriate times. And you say sod's law, something's going to happen when you least want it to happen, and it will happen. So I just wanted to say, how do I cope? Well, surprisingly, I think part of me is I'm fortunate that my career meant that I'd worked prior to becoming an unpaid carer and giving up my career. I worked as an archaeological conservator. And one of my jobs was to conserve timber that was found in the River Thames, which is in a very disgusting state. And my job was to prepare it ready for and conserve it every year. So I'm used to dealing with mucky materials. So in a way, maybe I was lucky that it didn't really faze me. And you get used to the person you care for. You know you want to do the best for them. And so you just put up with those sort of aspects of the unpredictability of suddenly wherever you are, something's going to happen. And I just did a little bit of research before I came onto this, because what strikes me is all the so-called support that you get for incontinence is very limited, but it's also fairly rudimentary and basic. And it does seem that the issues of incontinence, whether you have dementia or not, have not really moved on much since, presumably, or forever. I don't think there's the design of pants, pads, or anything else has not really changed very much. And I read a statistic that incontinence affects 400 million people globally, and that's 5% of the world's population. And very little is ever done to really improve people's quality of life if they're living with incontinence. And there is such a stigma still attached to it. We're perfectly accepting as human beings that babies have no control of their bodily functions. But as soon as we get bodily functions working as adults, or as children and as adults, suddenly there seems to be everyone gets stressed out about it, and we don't talk about it enough. We all know it's a bodily function that everyone has, but when you lose control of it, it can be very, very stressing for those who experience it for themselves, and for those who have to cope with it. And I would just say that apparently in this group of research from Southampton University, I'm somebody who fits into the category of poorly contained incontinence, lower impact, frequent out of place urine or fecal workload, but it's manageable. The person living with dementia lacks insight, but as his carer, I am unfazed by and plan for accidents. I also have good communication with wider social circles. So there are people out there researching people who think, well, she's coping, She has, you know, she's somebody it's not impacting. And it seems that research has been done for 10, 15 years and nothing has changed on how you deal with these issues. And basically, Paul's had UTIs, he's had bladder bleeding. I've had to cope with severe constipation and also other consequences. And it's something that I've never had any training from any professional organization to show me how to actually take care of him, to keep him clean. What's the best way to prevent infection? And people know, you learn that from experience and talking to other carers, or sometimes certain professionals, but or care groups and people living, people with and dementia organizations offer services online or whatever. But when you were talking about the beginning, you know, memory clinic gives a diagnosis, and when you see your GP, they don't actually tell you once they are aware that you're the person with dementia is now incontinent. They don't suggest actual ways that you can help deal with it. And I got an appointment, I'm sure lots of other people, with a continence nurse who refused to give me pull-up pants. My husband's quite young, he's extremely active. Nappy pads with tapes were hopeless for him. And it was only the brain hemorrhage that actually got me pull-up pants on the NHS, because they saw the state after he'd recovered from his surgery, that I ended up getting pull-up pants on the NHS. But before that, 6 months before that, I was told, no, you can't have pull-up pants on the NHS. You can only have the pants with straps and nappy type things. And they were useless because they were always leaking. And I know people today who've spent an absolute fortune on pull-up pants. And the advice is always, oh, we'll try this brand, try that brand. But, you know, we can send people to the moon. We give people medication for sleep disorders, for various things that their bodies do. But somehow nobody seemed to have worked out a way of trying to control, I don't know if it's the pituitary gland or the kidneys or whatever it is, but to try and control the sphincter muscle that controls bladder, you know, your bladder or your bowel. I'm sure there's plenty of research goes into it, but there's nothing out there. And I'm surprised that 400 million people across the world have got incontinence, and we still haven't done anything to make it better for people's lives, the quality of life. And so, on a note of practical tips, the one things I would say is that I've just found how I cope is if I'm lucky that Paul has managed to go to the toilet when we're at home, I have white vinyl I put down on the bathroom floor, because when you're cleaning somebody up, it's surprisingly how easy things can spread without you noticing. So for hygiene reasons, you can easily spot things that go down onto a white floor, and it can roll it up and put it away. I also, because we live in an old house and our plumbing's not that great, purchased large black rubber gauntlets, which do help. And when you're out, and because everyone gets embarrassed, I carry a little fresh air spray to do, because the disabled toilets are not working, or they're locked and the radar key doesn't work. Councils have changed the locks and people can't get into them. So to save other people's embarrassment and probably my own, I spray a little perfume spray around a public toilet. I'm sure there's loads of other things I could say to you about all the stresses. Oh, and I talk to a lot of friends and carers, and we share our horrendous stories. And my latest one was, I've just had knee surgery and I was due to get to the hospital for 10:30 in the morning. And the carer, I have employed carers to shower Paul in the morning. And just before I went for the train, he managed to go to the toilet. And I knew that if I'd left it, when I came out of surgery, I might have to be chasing around to clean up the bathroom. So I quickly got him changed in 30 minutes and managed to get to the hospital, and then had my blood pressure taken. And the lady said, oh, what perfect blood pressure. And I said, you would not believe what I just had to deal with. And I'm amazed that I've got such perfect blood pressure. So that's me, really. So keeping a good sense of humor is always a good idea.
Thank you, Jill. I mean, I was part of a project team that looked at, in Welsh hospitals and a few English hospitals, the pad culture, where people who were continent were put on pads because there was nobody around to take them to the toilet, and how that eventually led to becoming dependent on the pads. You know, they went incontinent, came out incontinent. You know, what can an incontinence nurse tell you? Well, they can tell you a lot, I suppose, how to access materials. We got a couple of questions here, and one from well, comments and questions. One from Rupi, which sort of enlarges on your point about help. And he says, no, they don't, Jill. It's all about you having to empower yourself with the knowledge of and lived experience and fight your corner. The ethos of existing behavior by professionals causes this. And I think that's absolutely spot on, because you know it's nurse knows best, isn't it? You know, and this is where the carers' experiences and knowledge are set aside. There's a question here from Ruth Eakin. I'm going to put it to you first, Jill, and then open it up. I was recently discussing support for carers, guidance for lifting, feeding, etc. Risk and governance was mentioned as a problem for professionals in showing how to best do things, or carer training. Is there anything that could change this to help with embracing carers as a voluntary workforce? In other words, do you think specialized carer training would be beneficial to you?
I think with hindsight, it probably would have been, but I think everyone comes to these points at different times, so it's probably impossible. I mean, we talk about, you know, I've just recently heard that my local authority has got an admiral nurse for the borough. Well, that's fantastic in the area where apparently this person is working with 3 medical practices in the north of our borough. And we all know how great the support is from admiral nurses for people living with dementia. But that's, you know, when you're on your own somewhere and you have no access to these things, then you know, we all know it all comes down to resources at the end of the day. But I do think GP practices should be much more aware of how much stress is put onto the carers as well. And they are, you know, you ask a question, oh, are you getting enough support? Well, you know, the very fact that they've asked you that question, it's a stupid question to ask, because they know the answer, that no, of course you're not getting enough support. But yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I did, funnily enough, at the weekend, I spoke to somebody who used to be, she was head of geriatrics at some health authority in North London. And she said before she retired, she'd hoped that GPs, they had lots of discussions with GPs about the importance of caring for people in all sorts of situations like this, and helping and supporting the carers. But it doesn't seem, I think maybe the pandemic changed the way doctors and practices work anyway. So, because I did ask the question, my husband's had lots of urine infections. How does anybody administer 4 times a day an antibiotic that's required to be taken before food or after food at certain hours? How does anyone who lives alone with their diagnosis cope with that kind of medication, unless they've got somebody who's a live-in carer, i.e. their unpaid carer who's living with them? Because carers who come to the house often can't come at the right time to take that kind of medicine. And this lady said, well, the reality is they don't deal with that kind of antibiotic administration. So they end up with, you know, probably potentially at the end, they die sooner than those who are cared for by people 24/7. And that's the reality of our system, that we're, you know, if you have a diagnosis of dementia and the carers that you live with, you don't get the fair treatment that other people are afforded by the NHS, because there is, we don't have procedures in place to make quality of life good for everyone involved with dementia. So you have to be resourceful yourself and work out ways of dealing with it yourself.
But the unfairness of that means, of course, that you could make a wrong decision, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And then they'd be criticised for it. The lack of support for carers is palpable. I mean, it really is. I mean, you can't speak to a carer who gets it all unless they pay astronomical sums to have, the chores taken away from them, and that's beyond most people's reach. Neil says, Rupi says, imagine what the world would be like if this type of behaviour would change, helping people to better qualities of life. It'd be more beneficial for everyone. And I think it is. I mean, to have help with, with day-to-day living includes having help with things like you were talking about, Jill. And we did a survey in my area, or I did a survey in my area, and I asked 200 people with dementia whether they went out anymore. They all said no, simply because of the lack of public toilets, the fear of incontinence, and I mean, it's a real thing. And, the Swansea Council said, oh, well, we've got 2 public toilets. 2 public toilets in the city centre. I mean, and if you're on a wheelchair, you can't fit into one of them. So you've got 1 toilet, really. So I do think people need to think about that. Can I just also generally ask you a question? As the inevitable decline comes in dementia, because it is a progressive illness, and we're only fooling ourselves if we don't recognize that. How much preparedness for carers to deal with the changes are you given? How much help? In other words, do people say there is another side of this coin,
I know that I know some people who the incontinence issue was the reason that the person they cared for had to go into residential care, because they couldn't cope with, whether it was because they were too far away or that when they were actually dealing with themselves, they just could not cope with it. It became too unmanageable. As I said, I'm really lucky that my husband's fairly compliant. So I don't have the resistance, and I don't have, I'm not fighting with him to keep him as safe as I can, to keep him clean, to be as hygienic as possible. And even with that, I have issues, because the way the catheter system works, you get infections regardless of how clean you try and be, and living in a pair of sort of damp pants, which have got potentially, got feces on them as well, or can have easily, you're bound to be getting ill. And the doctors say to you, when Paul was first diagnosed, well, he's got roughly an average of 8 years to live. That's what I was told initially. And he'll either probably die of pneumonia or a UTI, some kind of kidney failure from UTIs. And of course, at the time, I could understand pneumonia because I'd heard there were swallowing issues and all the rest of it. I didn't understand at the time, 6 years ago, what the significance of UTIs would be eventually. And, Paul's into year 6, nearly year 7, and he's doing pretty well, considering he's had 3 brain hemorrhages. But that's probably down to the fact that I am able to care for him, and I do cope with caring for him. It's really, I'm not blowing my own trumpet at all, because it is really hard, and I've had to, as everyone knows who cares for somebody, you sacrifice a huge amount of your life to look after the people you love. So I don't know how you can prepare it, but I do think when you do hit those crisis moments, or you need information, it doesn't help. I mean, I was once told I spent too much time looking up things on the internet and how to do things. I'd spent too much time Googling stuff. Well, if there's no one there to tell you how to do it, but it is funny sometimes.
Yeah, but I mean, Ruby
But in
says,
our own lives, I would personally, I know myself, I would be very stressed if, if I'd reached that stage myself of becoming incontinent. So it's not just people living with dementia who can go through this. We can all do that. And one of the things is, I don't think in society we do talk, as you know, there's 400 million people globally suffering, and that's what they know about. There must be probably far more that nobody's ever aware of, that suffer from some form of incontinence. We have campaigns for prostate cancer. We have campaigns for, all sorts. We talk about mental health now with a sort of, and hopefully an acceptance that it's not a taboo subject to talk about it. But talking about your bowel movements and your urine leakage or whatever, it's such a taboo subject still, and nobody really wants to talk about that for themselves or for others. It's a hard thing to deal with. Somebody did tell me something the other day, and I do think anyone who's got any idea of a media campaign, this lady, she's in her 60s, and she decided she was still traveling to work on the tube, and every time the tube doors open, she pulls in her pelvic floor and holds it, and when the tube doors close, she releases them, and that's how she practices pelvic floor exercises on her journey to work and on her journey home again. And I just thought, what a great idea. They should have posters outside on a tube. Door opens, pull in your muscles. Door closes, relax. Have some campaign like that out there for the tube, the train, the bus, any journey.
Yeah.
They should have an announcement. The train drivers should do an announcement just to remind us.
Well, men and women. I mean, I was sent penile muscle tension things for effectively a pelvic floor exercise for my husband with dementia to try by the continence nurse in the hospital. And you just thought, what is the point of that? How can I ask my husband now at this stage and try and get him to do something like that? It was ridiculous.
Well, you won't, will you? I mean, I've developed latchkey incontinence. The minute I'm outside the door, either going out or coming in, I feel the need to go to the loo.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is, but apparently it's quite a common thing. Well, thank you, Jill. Our next speaker is Ming. I'm sure that if you read the chat box, you'll see that there are people there, Jill, who are really grateful for what you said and will support you fully. Rupi says, "You're right. You're so right, Jill. Well said." Good morning, Ming.
Hi everybody. My name is Ming. I'm a drama script writer, and I was a sole carer for a long time for my late mum, who died at the beginning of 2020, thankfully just before the lockdowns. But she lived with dementia symptoms for, I would say, over 20 years. We were largely on our own, totally at home for about 10 of that. So I was a distance carer, 100 miles away in my home in London and going back and forth, and also in our family home, where I was increasingly spending a lot of time. So I'm going to talk about choosing a care home. But just before I say that, I think going on from what Jill has said about continence, I think the unique thing about dementia care and continence is that it's not just about lack of physical control either. There are cognitive aspects to do with particularly fecal incontinence. And for a lot of people, those are the really difficult things, because I think if it's just a question of not having physical control of your muscles, that's bad enough, but you can kind of plan for that. But I think what a lot of people find even harder is things like fecal incontinence and feces being put in unusual places, shall we say, normal kind of boundaries being overridden because the person just cognitively doesn't understand what you do with your bodily functions anymore. My mum would be leaving things in biscuit tins, in chests of drawers, so all of those kind of things are an additional challenge for people living with dementia that even people who've had like spinal injuries or brain injuries don't necessarily have to encounter. So I just throw that out there. And also I think that if you're dealing with continence at home, if you're a sole carer, even if you have people coming in, which we didn't have for most of the time, you know, if professionals deal with continence care, very often they will do it in a pair because they need to lift somebody, they need one person to hold while another person gets the dressings, all of those kind of things. A sole carer at home is under far more stress than a person who's a professional in that situation with all the training and equipment that they have at their disposal. And all types of incontinence can also cause skin breakdown, tissue breakdown, which is another kind of late stage knock on. You might get ulcers and abscesses, which, you know, continue a cycle of infection beyond the initial UTI. So I think there's all those things which are not talked about at all. And I think certainly I had no advice on it. And fortunately for us, that only really came to the fore once my mum was already in care. But anyway, so a bit of background. So I was shuttling back and forth, trying to support my mum in her own home for about 10 years. And then she spent the last 8.5 years of her life in 2 different care homes. There are lots of kind of factors involved in that. So I think looking back, obviously, I'm going to talk about my own experience, and that is my experience, and other people will have different circumstances. But I think the first thing I would say that choosing a move into care, if it's you with dementia, or choosing to move somebody into care, is a huge decision. And very often you will have been in your dementia situation for many years before you get to that point. So I think you're overcoming a lot of psychological hurdles as well as the practical things, which are hard enough. So I think don't underestimate that. Don't beat yourself up about feeling overwhelmed and stressed about it, because that's perfectly natural. It is a traumatic situation. I would say also don't try and judge yourself by other people's standards, because, you know, you'll read a lot of people commenting like below the line on newspaper articles about what to do about people going into care. This is terrible. The family should do it. You know, all that kind of stuff, traditional attitudes, women should stay at home and look after the family. Even close family who are not primary carers may be quite judgmental with you about considering a move into care. And I would say only you know your actual reality of your situation. So try to block out any criticism that you feel is coming from elsewhere, because only you can make a decision for yourself and your loved ones, okay? And also I would say, unlike me, if it's at all possible, don't leave it until you're really in crisis before you start thinking about residential care. I think it's very tempting for all of us to do that, because there has been such a stigma that people feel that it's failure, people feel that it's putting somebody away or abandoning them. And really it's not, because what you're doing is you're looking for a whole team of people who can support that person 24/7 when maybe you or your family can't do it by yourselves anymore. And that's not a bad thing. That's a positive thing to say, actually, we need a bigger team. We need somebody who's there in the middle of the night. We need people to change shifts, and we need facilities that I can't provide on my own at home. And so I think look at it in that context. And if at all possible, allow yourself the permission to think about it before it's a crisis. So it might be in the back of your mind ticking away, but you might say, like I did, well, firstly, I can't think about this till my mum's ready to accept it. And what I didn't understand is that there is a condition called, you can look it up, anosognosia, which is a condition which means that somebody who has maybe a brain injury or some form of degenerative brain disease like dementia, their very brain damage that causes their symptoms also prevents them from acknowledging that they have any decline in capacity. So very often if they have a care assessment, people would ask them, are you coping with this? Are you washing yourself? Are you able to manage the toilet? Are you able to manage stairs? Do you do your own cooking, cleaning and shopping? They will say yes, and they will be telling the absolute truth as they believe it. But very often that might not be true, and you might be doing all of those things on their behalf, and you might feel very frustrated and sometimes angry that they seem to be denying the reality of the situation. But you have to understand that sometimes they literally can't, because that's not how they see it. And it's a clinical condition, it's not denial. So for a long time, I was hoping that my mum, when things got bad enough, would admit that she needed help, and then we could plan for it together. And unfortunately, that time never came, and it never would, which I realized afterwards. So we were in a crisis situation where we'd been struggling for a long time. My mum was basically very distressed all the time. She'd got to the stage where she didn't recognize her own house. She couldn't even recognize which of 2 main bedrooms in the house were her own bedroom. She couldn't remember what was on the other side of a door within the house. So if she said, "Where's my handbag?" and I would say it's in the dining room, she'd go, "What's the dining room?" If I was making a cup of tea in the kitchen, she'd be calling out for me because she thought she was totally on her own, because she couldn't imagine that I had been there and I was just next door and I would be coming back. So all of those kind of things become very intense towards the latter stages. Not everybody will have all of those symptoms, but I'm just laying out what our situation was and why we got into crisis. So I would say, if you have any warning signs, don't wait until there is some actual physical crisis, as we had, where like my mum went out at night and the police had to be called to take her home, and it's all very traumatic. Allow yourself to think about it, allow yourself to start doing some early research. At least now online, you can start looking up stuff without having to leave the house, for instance. You can look up stuff without having to get stuff in the post that might upset the person, you know, behind their back. I would say give yourself permission to talk to friends and family about it, and don't worry about them being judgmental about it, because, as I say, it's your situation and you should take the lead on it. So do a bit of research beforehand. Look up what you can, but there is no substitute for actually visiting places. Now, in practical terms, options might be quite limited in your area, so you might not have a big choice. So in that case, I think draw up a short list, try and go and visit the places themselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about what to look out for in a minute. But I would just say, before we get on to that, a lot of people struggle with when is the right time for somebody to go into care. And I would say, I don't think there's any single right answer to that, because again, it depends very much on your own circumstances, how much support you have, both informal and formal, how resistant your person is to care. Because again, I mean, I think Jill is quite lucky in that her husband is compliant with help. Whereas I think my mum, because she didn't recognize that she had any needs, was sometimes very antagonistic. She wouldn't let me have anybody come into the house. She wouldn't even have a cleaner. If I tried to, we had a bath lift and a stair lift, but if I tried to even help her manage those, because she got to the point where she didn't know how to work them, she would fly off the handle at me and be very aggressive and antagonistic, and it would really damage our relationship. So in the end, I just gave up. So by the time she went into care, I would say she probably hadn't had a bath for maybe up to a year, which is quite shocking. But, you know, she would wash her face, she would do a bit of flannel on her hands, but, you know, she was very resistant to a lot of things. So I think when is the time will depend a lot on your circumstances and the stage of the person. It would depend on their personality as well. It will depend on whether you as a carer are also trying to hold down a full-time job, whether you've got any income from anywhere else. All of these things are important, but, you know, people tend to be very judgmental and say, well, you should just put everything on hold, you should sacrifice everything. And I think, you know, you've got to look at the situation in the round and see it as being a decision which is going to actually make life better for all of you. And I can say quite honestly that my mum, once she moved into care, she settled to it a lot more easily than I expected her to. I was probably more traumatized than her, because I knew what had gone on and what had been the difference in life. Whereas I think by that stage, she was quite content once her actual needs were met, and once she felt that she was secure, that she had people around all the time. It's also very tempting to think that only you uniquely can give that person what they need, because you're the person who loves them best. But actually, beyond a certain stage, I think, you know, practical needs being met and the reassurance of constant presence in the room can actually be more important to that person than having a particular individual there. And that's kind of sometimes quite hard to accept. I found that very hard to accept, and it took me several years after my mum was in care to fully understand it, that actually it wasn't necessarily me as myself that she needed somebody to do all these things for her. She needed reassurance from somebody, but it didn't always have to be me. So that's background. So the time will depend on your circumstances. And as Jill has said, you know, triggers for some people will include continence, particularly the cognitive aspects of continence, as I've described. There might be aggression with some people that might be very difficult for a carer managing on their own at home. And again, very difficult to broach that with people outside. So you might be trying to keep it behind closed doors, and then it comes to the point where you're just too scared and you feel that you can't physically manage it anymore. And I would say if there are any warning signs of that, please do try and put some plans in place before you get to the crisis. And paranoid symptoms, which is what my mum had. So that I think in the end, I got to the stage where I realized that because her home was no longer a sanctuary to her, you know, so she'd always said to me since I was a little girl, oh, never put me in a home. And you just kind of go, of course I won't. But I think she had never understood a situation that we would be in. And I realized by that late stage that because she didn't recognize her own home, it was all frightening to her. She felt she'd been dumped in, as she would put it, an empty hotel. She would be going out at night to try and look back at the house to get her bearings. So everything was frightening to her. Everything was unknown. So I think in that context, I said to myself, well, actually, if she's going to be frightened wherever she is, it's at least better that she's physically safe somewhere where there are other people around to look after her. And once I'd actually got her there, she actually became a lot more content and peaceful because, you know, she wasn't constantly calling out for people because there was always somebody there. So I think that was a watershed for us. So what are you looking for when you've actually decided that you need some care? Now, local word of mouth from trusted friends is always the best guide, I would say, but I recognize that for a lot of people that's not possible. So do your homework, look at what's online and look at what's in the literature, talk to professionals where you can. The trouble with professionals though, like GPs and social workers and district nurses, is they're not allowed to recommend particular places. So although they probably have a very good idea of what they consider to be the good homes in the area, they're not allowed to tell you that in as many words. So you've got to do a lot of reading between the lines. I would say don't take brochures and websites at face value because you have to remember that they are primarily commercial marketing tools. Care, unfortunately, is a commercial business. So they will all say we have dementia training, we have person-centered care, we have this, we have that. They might well do, but don't rely on them saying it. It's like politicians saying, we care about this, we care about that. When you go to the home, look for practical evidence that they actually practice what they preach. Ask them to show you those things in action. And don't be blinded by things like fancy decor and things like cinemas and cafes and fancy gardens and chickens in the garden and all of that stuff. All of those are nice extras. It's a nice environment to visit. But remember that what you're looking for is a home, not a hotel or a timeshare. And I have a blog called Dementia Just Ain't Sexy, which I'll put the links in later, but I've written at some length about this there, that what I always say is, remember, fancy curtains can't hold your hand when you're dying. So what matters in a home, number one, number two, number three, and number everything is staff. So the staff are your number one concern. So when you go to the home, and again, you're not going to find this on a brochure or a website, you have to go there and meet them. You want to see that there are enough of them per head of people in whatever unit it is. If it's a nursing unit, you would expect there to be twice as many as there are in a residential unit. I think these days a ratio of about 1 to 6 is quite common. It's not as good as it used to be, but that is what you will generally find. And ask about night care, because generally you will find there's maybe one, you know, half that at night time, but you still need night care. Make sure that you're able to speak to the staff. So again, when you visit, if the home is very open with their culture and saying, yes, okay, you've made an appointment to come in, which I think since COVID you have to now. In the old days, you could just rock up and that would be a good test if they let you in unannounced. But see if they're happy for you to just wander around and chat with anybody, including the cleaners, the receptionist, all of the care staff. Do they look relaxed and happy? Do they have time to talk to you? Do they have time to chat with their residents rather than just doing physical tasks? Things like ask them how long they've been there, because a lot of care homes, obviously recruitment is very difficult these days, particularly after Brexit. But it's a good sign if they have staff who have been there more than a couple of years. Very often now you will find that churn is so fast that people may be only there 6 months or a year. So ask how long people have been there, ask what kind of experience they've got with specialist dementia care. Very often they will say, the provider says we train all our staff, but that may well be just on an online module that they have to do on top of their caring duties. So, you know, ask about what form that takes, how useful the staff find it, how they're able to put it into practice. Do they have staff who are mature? Because again, it's much cheaper to have young school leavers who might be very nice people, but you know, they're obviously not going to have the wealth of experience of knowing how to behave with people with cognitive disabilities. So it's a good sign if there are some older, more experienced people there and they're happy to work for that provider over a long period of time. Meet the manager and get a sense, you will get a sense of the culture of a home from what kind of personality the manager has and how hands-on they are. Do they go around the building? Do they get stuck in with care when need be? Are they approachable? Can families speak to them? Can residents speak to them? Do they have a background in social care or nursing? Because it might surprise you to know that not everyone does. They might come from other types of management like prisons or commercial environments. So I think it's always a good sign if somebody does have a nursing or social care background, because they know, you know, the actual practical challenges. And also just trust your gut instinct, because I think, yes, make a short list and write down your pros and cons, depending on things like location and, you know, what kind of facilities they have, you know, funding models and all that kind of thing. But ultimately, I think if you've got 2 or 3 places, and if you're lucky, if you have, to choose from, I think go with your gut instinct, because the actual atmosphere of the place will tell you as much as what you can read and what you're told. Also, I think beware of the limitations of CQC gradings, because beware that they are a statutory inspection, which will generally take place, you know, annually, if that, sometimes less than that. And it takes a while for that grading to work through the system. And what they're looking at is a certain number of paper records. They will look at audits. They will interview a sample number of residents and staff and families on the day, but that is literally 1 or 2 days out of a year, or maybe 2 years. And things can change quite rapidly in care homes with a change of management. So I think, you know, take a look at that, but don't take it as gospel that if it says this is good, or this is inadequate, or this needs requirement, you know, that is gospel and that's always going to be the case, because things can change quite a lot. So again, trust your gut instinct, trust what you hear from the staff and the residents and the other families, trust your feeling about the manager. Yeah, visiting rules, obviously since COVID, those may have changed somewhat, but I think obviously it has been, it always was important, but I think it's even more important now to know what's the provider's policy on visiting. Are you able to visit whenever you want to? What restrictions might be placed on that? Inevitably, if somebody's in care, there might be incidents of things like norovirus, where they will have to shut a home for a couple of weeks to kind of let that infection clear. But you know, you need to know what the policies are and what's reasonable and what's not, so that you know what to expect. Future proofing, I think just beware that if somebody is moving into care at kind of mid-stage, as my mum did, so she was kind of mobile and socially aware, but she was in need of kind of what we call keypad access, basically, that once she's in the unit, you have to have a keypad to go in and out so that people are not wandering dangerously and getting into difficulties. That you might need a progression onto a nursing unit later on, and that may or may not be available within the same home. So it's always good to kind of look at your options. And if you have the possibility to choose a home that has both types of care, that's usually quite a good thing. Then it's not so traumatic to move somebody out into a different home later on. Also, just beware of the differences between residential and nursing, because I think, you know, in a panic, very often people don't know the difference. And, you know, you might be quite shocked if you go to a home that's only nursing and you find people mostly in bed or immobile, and you think, gosh, they don't have any stimulation, any social activities, you know, it feels really depressing. But actually, by a later stage, people might not want too much stimulation. They might appreciate being a bit calmer and more quiet. And actually, in those circumstances, the dementia side of things might be less important than the nursing side. Whereas somebody who is still active and mobile, especially people with younger onset, will appreciate somewhere that's got more facilities and more social interaction and more activities going on. So I think, just be aware of the difference in that and the difference in staffing ratios, because in nursing, you will need somebody who is a qualified nurse on the premises to administer registered drugs. You will usually need twice the number of carers for things like lifting with hoists and helping people with mobility and incontinence, and managing distress behaviour. So I think just be aware of those differences and try and plan for them if you can. And again, being realistic, you might not have all of those options in your area. Funding wise, that might not be available to you. But I think draw up a wish list so that you've at least got in the back of your mind A, B, and C. This is what I ideally would like. This is what I could accept if I have to. And this is what I absolutely won't accept. And finally, just a word about respite, because I think some people think that respite can be a good way into testing out long-term care, and it can. But I think, again, just be aware of the limitations of that, because any kind of move is always disruptive, any change in routine. And if you're moving somebody into a care home for only a couple of weeks, that's going to be a very unfamiliar and frightening environment for them. The staff are not going to know them as well as they would do a long-term resident. You are going to be stressed and depressed and frightened of what's happening to them. So you probably won't be able to relax very much. And very often people will be so reluctant, they will only go for a week or 2 weeks, and then the person comes back and it's all been a disaster because they've lost their hearing aids or their glasses, they've got into difficulties, they've maybe had to fall in the home, and that puts people off. And I would say you just have to be realistic that actually, if you're going to ask for a respite, if you can have a month's respite, I know lots of people won't be able to, but if you can arrange that, that is probably a better, both as respite itself, which will give you more time to relax and recharge your batteries for them to come home. And also it will give you a better experience of what life in care is like, because they have more time to settle and more time for the staff to get to know them individually. So I think don't be put off by trying that, but just be aware that actually a shorter stay can be more disruptive than a longer one. I think very often people are reluctant to go for a longer one because they are scared. And I've had this with friends of mine, that they didn't want to put their mum into respite, even because they were scared that she would get used to it and they were afraid of letting go of her. So I think you've got to be honest with yourself emotionally as well as what is it you're scared of, and what is actually best for the person and what is best in the round for all of you. So it's quite a lot to think about there, and I've probably overrun my time there, but if there's anything that you want to read about in more detail, I have written about all of these various topics on my blog, which is called Dementia Just Ain't Sexy, if you Google that. So there's lots of stuff about our experience of moving my mum into care, the emotional aspects of that, and also the crisis that took us there.
Thank you, Meg. I mean, how do you follow that? In the course of time and time alone, I'm going to bring this to an end now, because we've basically run out of time. Can I personally thank you all for sharing your experiences this morning? It's been absolutely brilliant. And the participants, can I thank you all for logging in? I'm sure you found this helpful, and I'm sure we'll have a follow-up. I'll remind you that this webinar will be on the website shortly. So if you've missed anything or you want to recall anything, you can watch it again. Our next webinar is a fortnight today, and it's on co-production, my favorite subject. So we look forward to seeing you then. Take care. If you're out in the heat, don't forget, stay hydrated. If you've got friends who are living with a diagnosis, make sure they drink lots of water. And for once, it seems odd enough, for once, forget about the incontinency, because it's very important to be hydrated. Goodbye to everybody, and thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.